Some crimes begin with a gunshot, others with absolute silence. But in June of 1985, it was the metallic scrape of a vice being lifted from a store shelf that set in motion one of the most disturbing criminal cases in United States history. A small hardware store in rural California, an ordinary backdrop for a chapter that should never have been written. Under the cold fluorescent lights, an Asian man carried out a petty theft, almost casually, as if it were second nature. The store's security guard noticed the movement, stepped in to stop him, and the thief bolted out the front door. Outside, a vehicle was waiting. In the driver's seat sat a man with a calm, almost blank expression. He didn't run. He didn't resist. This was Leonard Lake. His composure wasn't the kind born of innocence, but the kind that comes from hiding things too dark to bring into the light. A search of the vehicle changed everything. Inside the trunk, police found firearms, fake IDs, and suspicious notes. It was as if Lake wasn't just one man, but several identities stitched together. At the station, before the interrogation could even begin, he asked for a glass of water. What seemed like a simple request was about to take a lethal turn. Hidden in his shirt pocket was a small capsule of cyanide. Lake drank the water, swallowed the poison, and within moments began to convulse. His breathing faltered, his body tensed. The officers didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Leonard Lake was dead, by his own choice, taking with him answers the world would never hear. That death wasn't an ending. It was the start of something far worse. A background check led officers to an isolated property in the wooded hills of Wilseyville, Calaveras County. Locals called it the strange place. Now it became the epicenter of an investigation that would drag law enforcement into the darkest recesses of the human mind. No one on the team could have imagined that the theft, the arrest, and the suicide were just the surface. Because beneath the rural facade of that property lay a hidden world. A place where horror wasn't just committed, it was cultivated. And somewhere out there, the other man from that morning, the one who ran, was still free. The road to Wilseyville was narrow, lined with towering trees that blocked much of the sunlight. Even on bright days, shadows clung to the dirt path like a shroud. At the very end, hidden from view, stood Leonard Lake's property. From a distance, it looked like any other rural homestead. A small house, a couple of sheds, and plenty of land. But to anyone paying attention, something felt off. Reinforced doors, boarded windows, a silence that hung in the air even when the wind blew. Neighbors had long described the place as peculiar. They spoke of late-night activity, unfamiliar cars pulling in and out, muffled noises that were quickly dismissed. Nothing substantial enough to call the police, until the day Leonard Lake died in custody. Suddenly, every odd detail became a possible clue. The sense that something terrible had been hidden here became impossible to ignore. When investigators arrived, they found the house locked tight. Inside, nothing appeared chaotic or hastily abandoned. Everything was exactly where someone had wanted it to be. The smell of mildew and rust hung in the air. One room contained drawers filled with fake IDs, handwritten journals, and lists of names. Another held maps and hand-sketched construction plans, but none of it prepared them for what they were about to discover. Behind the main house, partially concealed by overgrown brush, stood what looked like a simple storage shed. The door was camouflaged, blending into the surroundings. When officers forced it open, they found a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The beams from their flashlights caught bare concrete walls, no windows, no natural light, only the oppressive weight of air that felt heavy, stale, almost alive. What lay beneath wasn't a war shelter. It was a structure designed for one purpose: captivity. Steel doors, soundproofed walls, cramped holding cells. The architecture itself was a tool for domination. Every detail served to ensure that once someone entered, their voice and their hope would never leave. And in one of those dark chambers, investigators made their first grim discovery: human remains, burned bones, fragments of teeth, bits of twisted metal that looked like melted wedding rings. This was no random crime scene. This was the opening chapter to something far more horrifying, and the man who had fled that day was still out there. With Leonard Lake dead, the investigation now focused on the other man from the hardware store, the one who had escaped. He wasn't just an accomplice, he was the missing half of the equation. His name, Charles Ng. Born in Hong Kong, he grew up under the strict and often abusive hand of a controlling father. Discipline ruled his household, but affection was nowhere to be found. As a teenager, Ung found small crimes gave him a sense of power he never had at home. Petty thefts, street fights, and forgery became part of his daily life. By the time he was 18, he had already crossed paths with the law more than once. When he moved to the United States, he didn't join the military out of patriotism. He enlisted to escape prison time. Ung's time in the Marines was short-lived. He quickly fell into stealing weapons and ammunition, which landed him in a military prison. It was there, behind bars, that fate brought him into contact with Leonard Lake. Lake, already immersed in survivalist ideology and apocalyptic fantasies, had placed an ad in a magazine looking for someone who shared his extreme beliefs. Ung answered. 2 lives, worlds apart, converging in a shared moral abyss. When they met in person, the connection was immediate. Lake, older and calculated, saw in Ung the perfect extension of his plans. Impulsive and violent, found in Lake not just a partner but a mentor who legitimized his darkest instincts. Lake wrote the script. Ung brought it to life. Together they formed a synergy of control and brutality. This alliance was the beginning of an unrestrained reign of terror. Victims were chosen carefully, not just for vulnerability, but for how well they could be molded into Lake's twisted vision of control. Ung, more aggressive, didn't hesitate to use immediate violence, while Lake preferred to prolong suffering, documenting every detail. Now, with Lake gone, the search for Ung became urgent. Without the calculating brain to guide him, what remained was the blade, unpredictable, dangerous, and free. Every day he stayed at large was another day the body count could rise. Hidden behind the rural facade of Leonard Lake's property, the underground bunker was more than a secret room. It was an engineered monument to control and cruelty. Dug deep into the rocky ground with near-military precision, the space was narrow, windowless, and sealed with reinforced steel doors. Every feature was calculated to imprison, not protect. A central hallway led to small, cramped cells, some with soundproofing so effective that no scream could escape. The air was stale, laced with mildew and rust, heavy with the weight of despair. Light came only from bare bulbs, casting warped shadows that made the space feel even more oppressive. Inside, the design left no doubt. Suffering was the intended purpose. Chains bolted to walls, hooks anchored in ceilings, and a single bucket in the corner of each cell served as both toilet and humiliation. Every element was chosen to break a person down, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The bunker wasn't improvised. It was the physical blueprint of Leonard Lake's mind. Lake saw the bunker as the fulfillment of his Miranda plan, a twisted vision of enslaving women for breeding after an imagined societal collapse. Charles Ung brought brutality to the plan, acting with violent immediacy. Together they operated like technicians running an experiment, watching, testing limits, and discarding subjects when they no longer served a purpose. Evidence was everywhere. In metal boxes, investigators found meticulously kept journals, diagrams, lists of names, and VHS tapes labeled with cold, clinical titles. Each tape would later prove to be an unflinching record of calculated torment, filmed with patience, as if time itself was part of the ritual. The bunker was more than a prison. It was a stage, and every act that played out in its walls ended the same way, with a door locking shut and silence swallowing the air. Inside the bunker, in a locked metal box, investigators found what at first looked like ordinary evidence. VHS tapes, each labeled with a name, a date, and a sterile, emotionless title. But when played, they revealed not just crimes. They revealed the minds of 2 men who had turned suffering into a performance. On the tapes, women appeared trembling, their eyes already hollow from hopelessness. One was identified as Brenda O'Connor, pleading for her baby's life in a voice so faint it barely rose above a whisper. In the background, Ung smiled while Lake, with the calm tone of a teacher, issued precise instructions. There was no rush. They wanted every second. The footage showed methodical torture, alternating between physical violence and psychological degradation. At times, the perpetrators discussed theories of domination and control, as if debating philosophy rather than inflicting pain. In other moments, they laughed, cold, detached, while the screams echoed within the bunker's walls. What made the tapes even more disturbing was the composure of the men filming them. There was no frenzy, no chaos, only the deliberate pace of someone documenting a process. Lake and Ung sought the exact moment when a victim's will broke. when fear replaced hope entirely. For them, that was the true prize. Each tape became irrefutable evidence, but also a scar for those who watched. Seasoned detectives lost sleep. Prosecutors had nightmares. Some professionals walked away from the case entirely, because watching those recordings wasn't just witnessing a crime. It was staring into an abyss that stared back. The tapes sealed Charles Ng's legal fate. They left no room for denial, and they revealed one final chilling truth. For Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, recording pain wasn't about proof. It was about preserving their trophies. For Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, victims weren't chosen at random. Each target was the result of observation, calculation, and cold criteria. Often they placed ads in newspapers to lure couples or single women, offering jobs, cheap rent, or business opportunities. The bait was perfect. Innocent promises that led people straight to the isolation of their property without raising suspicion. Once the victims arrived, their fates were decided quickly. Men were seen as obstacles, almost always eliminated first. Women were kept alive, but not out of mercy. They were part of the Miranda plan, subjected to captivity, bound in tight hogtie restraints, locked in narrow cells, and deprived of any human contact except for their captors. The manipulation extended beyond the property. Lake forged letters to send to victims' families, imitating handwriting and crafting believable excuses. "I'm traveling. I need some time away." Some of these messages arrived days after the murders, buying them valuable time to destroy evidence and plan their next moves. They also infiltrated victims' social circles, visiting relatives under the guise of concern, gathering information about any ongoing searches or investigations. Their control was absolute, both over their captives and the narrative outside the bunker. This level of meticulousness still impresses and horrifies experts today. Lake and Ng were not impulsive killers. They were methodical, disciplined, and fully aware of their actions. There was no remorse, only efficiency. Every step seemed to follow an unwritten manual on how to erase lives without leaving a trace. At the heart of it all was a twisted belief that they had the right to decide who lived and who died. In their minds, it wasn't murder. It was the exercise of a privilege they thought they'd earned. The soil of Leonard Lake's Wilseyville property held secrets that time itself couldn't erase. As soon as excavation began, cadaver dogs marked multiple spots across the grounds. Each flagged area was a silent invitation to uncover interrupted lives. In the first shallow graves, investigators found charred bones, human teeth, and twisted bits of metal, some still fused with the remnants of melted wedding bands. The remains were far from intact. Many had been burned beyond recognition. Others were fragmented to the point of defying identification. Among them were children's bones, deliberately mixed with adult remains, as if to erase not just lives, but the very identities of the victims. It was destruction with a final, calculated cruelty. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a rusted metal bucket, warped by fire, filled with bone fragments, teeth, and wedding rings. Nearby, investigators found partially burned photographs, diaries, and personal documents. It looked less like discarded evidence and more like a macabre trophy collection, preserved not from guilt, but from pride. Neighbors who had once dismissed the property as simply odd began recalling eerie details. Muffled cries carried on the wind, lights burning late into the night, cars arriving and leaving in quick visits. Small details that, alone, seemed harmless, but now painted a horrifying picture. The peculiar property had been a carefully managed graveyard. In total, authorities confirmed at least 11 victims, but forensic experts believe the true number could exceed 25. The destruction of evidence combined with the state of the remains left gaps that will never be filled. For some families, the absence of official confirmation meant their grief would remain suspended in a cruel, endless limbo. For the investigators, each shovelful of dirt unearthed more than just bones. It unearthed the realization that, for years, unimaginable horror had thrived in silence, hidden in plain sight, just beyond the tree line. With Leonard Lake dead, all attention turned to the man who had escaped the day of the hardware store theft, Charles Ng. He was no longer just an accomplice. He was the sole surviving link to a string of horrors. His escape was swift and deliberate, crossing the border into Canada as if confident that distance and bureaucracy would shield him. But old habits die hard. Within months, Ng was caught shoplifting again, this time in Calgary. It was a compulsion he couldn't seem to control. and it became his undoing. His arrest should have been the end of the chase, but instead it triggered a legal battle that would drag on for nearly a decade. The United States demanded his immediate extradition. The process was anything but simple. Canadian law prohibited the extradition of prisoners who faced the death penalty. NG's lawyers seized on this, filing appeals, challenging evidence, and exploiting every legal loophole. Meanwhile, Ng sat in Canadian prisons, arrogant and theatrical, acting as though he still controlled the pace of the game. For the families of the victims, each year of delay was agony. Justice felt like it was suspended, just out of reach. For Ng, each hearing was an opportunity, a stage to keep himself relevant and to bask in the attention he had always craved. Finally, in 1991, after relentless legal wrangling, Canada approved his extradition under assurances that he would receive a fair trial. Ng was flown back to California, where prosecutors had been building one of the most complex and costly cases in the state's history. With physical evidence, videotapes, and witness testimony, they were prepared for war. Yet even with overwhelming evidence, Ng refused to yield. He denied direct involvement, shifted blame onto Leonard Lake, and portrayed himself as the victim of an unjust system. It was a performance, calculated not to win, but to preserve the illusion that he still held some measure of power. Charles Ng's return to the United States set the stage for one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in California history. The prosecution came armed with an overwhelming arsenal: the VHS tapes, Leonard Lake's meticulously kept journals, forensic evidence, and testimony from experts who had studied the case in depth. Still, the defense tried to cast Ng as a passive observer, a man swept into Lake's depravity rather than a willing architect of it. Inside the courtroom, Ng behaved as if it were his personal theater. He smirked at inappropriate moments, scribbled notes as the tapes played, and even corrected small details about the bunker, as if to remind everyone of his intimate knowledge. For the families of the victims seated in the gallery, his demeanor was a wound reopened with every smirk and every glance. The jury watched as the tapes showed Ng and Lake side by side, carrying out acts that seemed rehearsed. The victims were stripped not only of their freedom but of their humanity, their voices drowned out by insults and commands. It was not chaos, it was a deliberate, orchestrated cruelty. The defense deployed every delay tactic imaginable: procedural challenges, requests for postponement, and accusations of prosecutorial misconduct. Ng seemed to relish the slow pace, as though dragging the process out was another form of control. But public outrage and the sheer weight of the evidence made the outcome inevitable. In 1998, after months of testimony and a price tag exceeding $10 million, the verdict was delivered: guilty on 11 counts of first-degree murder, including the deaths of 2 infants. The sentence was unequivocal: death. Ng listened without visible reaction, as if the announcement were merely another line in a script he believed he was still writing. For the families, the verdict was a step toward justice, but no cure for their grief. It was the formal acknowledgement of what they had long known: that their loved ones had been lost to a darkness so calculated it could never truly be measured. Charles Ng's death sentence did not close the book on this case. Since 1998, he has remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison, living in isolation, afforded rights and appeals that stand in stark contrast to the cruelty he showed his victims. Through endless legal maneuvering, he continues to delay the inevitable, ensuring his name stays alive in court documents and news headlines. Neither Leonard Lake nor Charles Ng was ever deemed insane. Forensic psychiatrists who examined their writings and recordings concluded they acted with full awareness of their actions. Lake, methodical and detached, planned with the precision of an engineer. Ng, impulsive and sadistic, executed with raw brutality. Together, they formed a rare, deadly partnership, each filling the other's void. Lake's journals and tapes serve as a kind of psychological autopsy. They contain logical reasoning, articulate language, and cold justifications for acts that defy morality. There was no remorse, only rationalized evil. Ng, in contrast, displayed overt pleasure in physical domination, often laughing at the suffering of others. Today, the Wilseyville property is an empty plot of land, but for those who know its history, the space feels heavy, as if the ground itself remembers. Locals whisper that on the quietest nights, an unsettling stillness settles over the area, a lingering echo of the atrocities committed there. The Lake and Ng case continues to be studied by criminologists and law enforcement as proof that evil doesn't have to be chaotic to be devastating. It can be organized, meticulous, and disguised behind ordinary appearances, making it all the more dangerous. For investigators, the lesson is clear. Never ignore the subtle signs. Never dismiss the gut feeling that something is wrong. Because when horror thrives in silence, time only works in favor of those willing to wait. And Leonard Lake and Charles Ng waited until someone by chance stumbled upon the gates of the hell they built.